Hello, class. This will be our final lecture in Bio 322, Evolutionary Biology this semester. And the topic is one that maybe some of you have been waiting for, maybe not, but the topic is going to focus on the evolution of our own species. Uh, this is something that is going to be somewhat introductory because obviously you could probably dedicate an entire semester to just studying the evolution of our species. And in fact, that is called an anthropology class. So this is going to be a sort of brief look into what we know about evolution from, about human evolution from the perspectives that we have learned in our class so far. So there are some recommended readings associated with this topic. In Bergstrom and Dugatkin's second edition, this is covered in chapter 19. And in Futuyma and Kirkpatrick's fourth edition, this is covered in chapter 21. So take a chance to read those items if you can. That will help you gain a better sense of what this is all about. So, humans, what are we? Are we just some sort of weird science fiction creation? Well, no, it turns out that our species does fall within the phylogeny of life, specifically within the mammalian phylogeny. And within the mammalian phylogeny, we are found in a family known as the great apes, or the Hominidae. And so we can see this phylogenetic tree here showing kind of various lineages throughout life. And here are humans, and in this tree, our sister taxa are chimpanzees. And of course, we can see all of these various characteristics that have evolved over long periods of time, giving rise to multicellular organisms, giving rise to more complicated things like the nervous system, giving rise to things like the vertebrae, things like the tetrapod form, amniotic eggs, etc., the placenta, which is unique amongst certain lineages of mammals, binocular vision, loss of a tail, and finally bipedalism. So all of these characteristics that are shared by various lineages that evolved over time, which share a common ancestor, the last universal common ancestor of all living things, all of these traits have been inherited by the common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees, with the exception of bipedalism. Bipedalism is kind of a unique trait amongst Homo sapiens, and it's one of a handful of traits that makes us unique compared to our closest relatives. Now, what do we know about the timing of human evolution? Well, it appears, based on all most reasonable evidence, that the lineage giving rise to Homo sapiens split from the lineage giving rise to our sister taxa, chimps and bonobos, about 7 million years ago. So there's been a fairly long period of time that has elapsed since we last shared a common ancestor with some of the other great apes. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Now, we talked about bipedalism as being an important trait that differentiates Homo sapiens from other great apes. And in fact, that certainly is an important trait that probably enabled humans to become a very, very successful lineage, or rather hominins, the lineage giving rise to humans. This is a trait that allowed them to be a very successful lineage. But there were other traits as well. And one of the traits that we think of as being particularly important, in addition to bipedalism, is the increased size of the cranium. And if we compare the morphology of Homo sapiens, this is a cartoon drawing of modern Homo sapiens. If we compare that to this cartoon drawing of a chimpanzee, we can see some distinct differences in the structure of the cranium, the size of the cranium, also the size of the pelvis, which may be related to the bipedal form that humans have that chimpanzees lack. And there's some other sort of differences we can see within the sort of overall bone structure of Homo sapiens compared to that of chimpanzees. So there is some level of descent with modification going on in the lineage giving rise to hominins, which is the lineage giving rise to our genus Homo. But as we'll see in a moment when we look at a different phylogeny, that hominins include other genera as well, not just the genus Homo. So it's important to recognize that hominins are not the same thing as hominids, which refers to all members of the family Homidae. So what's going on with these two particular traits, bipedalism and increased cranium size? Well, first of all, when we think about bipedalism, we probably want to frame the evolutionary circumstances under which bipedalism was favored by natural selection in a historical context. And we can think of that historical context as being the environment in which the earliest hominins evolved. And that environment was probably something similar to this image shown on the right, which was the ancient African savanna. Now, we know that there was some significant amount of climate change going on in Africa around the time that hominins first evolved. And probably it originally was much more tropical. And so probably it was a much more forested environment. But as the climate changed and began to dry out, the savanna began to form. And instead of having sort of continuous homogeneous forest across the landscape was more patchy with different groups of trees interdispersed amongst large areas of what we call savanna or prairie land, grasslands, if you will. And so it's sort of hypothesized that the evolution of bipedality was favored because it enabled the ancestors of hominins or Homo sapiens to be able to, rather than climb from tree to tree, which is what we see in chimpanzees and bonobos, rather than just climbing from tree to tree, they were forced with an environment that where they had to be able to walk between trees. So instead of having to just climb between trees in order to go and find resources and do stuff, they would have to get out of the trees and travel across the ground and then find other trees to go and get resources from, etc., or shelter as well. And so it's thought that bipedality was favored because it enabled individuals to be able to travel from one patch of trees to the next because trees were not continuous so much within the landscape. So that is one idea behind why bipedality was favored. Not only that, but there's evidence to suggest that bipedality has enabled the lineage giving rise to Homo or Homo sapiens, the ability to travel really long distances. And we know that, in fact, that is probably something that happened because our species has basically traveled the entire globe by foot over very large periods of time. The sort of life history, or rather one of the major life history strategies of early hominins was that of scavengers. And so early hominins, in fact, were not, well, we don't think that they were hunters. We think that they scavenged off the remains left behind by other hunting organisms, perhaps maybe large game animals. And one of the principal food sources of early hominins was bone marrow. And so oftentimes if a large game animal killed a prey and it left sort of some scraps behind, there wasn't a whole lot of meat to eat, wasn't really a whole lot there in terms of nutrition, but the bones still contained nutritious marrow within. And so early hominins, we think, probably started learning how to use tools, very simple stone tools, to break open bones that were left behind in order to get the marrow out of these bones and feed off of that marrow. And so when we think about this early hominin environment, this sort of savanna-like environment where bipedality has become favored, and these individuals are sort of making a living off of scavenging off the scraps of large game animals, it sort of sets the stage for the beginnings of the evolutionary trajectory that leads to our own species. In addition to bipedality, the increased cranium size, not surprisingly, facilitates a larger brain. And it's not surprising to think that a larger brain is positively correlated with things like the ability to build tools, the ability to undergo problem solving. In fact, we can even start asking questions about at what point in time were the earliest hominins applying the scientific method to solve problems? And that's an interesting question. We could even extend that question to other species. And perhaps application of the scientific method is not a purely hominin trait. Perhaps other organisms use it as well. But certainly in this early African savanna environment, probably there was some level of application of trial and error being the simplest form of use of the scientific method in our very ancient ancestors. And so when we talk about the brain in early hominins, we also can talk about the evolution of language. And it's possible, it's been hypothesized that language could have been an adaptation linked to selection for other early innovative traits, such as tool use, or creativity, or the ability to exercise forethought, the ability to plan ahead and figure out how to problem solve. Again, perhaps application of the scientific method was a thing. But certainly there's reason to believe that the increased cranium size of early hominins probably facilitated the ability to begin becoming involved in using more advanced, more complicated forms of communication, actual language, word structure, sentence structure, etc. And so this is thought to be a very, very important trait in the early evolution of hominins. Now, language might not have been very complicated at first, but over time, we know that language has become very complicated. And if you think about this from an anthropological perspective, language is certainly something used to classify different cultural groups. And there is cultural inheritance via language that has been going on in our species and probably in our ancestors for the ancestors of our species, that is, other genera of Homo and even genera that predate Homo. Language has probably existed in some capacity for quite a long time. So let's look at how the evolutionary history of lineages giving rise to Homo sapiens sort of unfold. And it kind of turns out that the evolution of hominins follows a fairly complex radiation. And this radiation is still being pieced together in the fossil record today. So we're not 100% sure exactly how the whole thing played out, but we do have a pretty good sense of the time frame based on being able to date the fossils that have been recovered. However, there are some gaps in the fossil record because fossils from certain periods of time simply have not been recovered. But we do know, as mentioned earlier, that probably or rather the lineage giving rise to hominins shares its most recent common ancestor with that of chimps and bonobos about 7 million years ago. And so that places us at the bottom of this sort of piecemeal phylogenetic tree here. And the earliest ancestors of the hominins were things like Sahelanthropus, things like maybe Oroyan. But these things were not very hominin-like. They were much more like chimpanzees or bonobos. They were much more ape-like. They were not bipedal, and they maybe didn't necessarily have especially large brains. The earliest evidence we have of a transitionary fossil between apes and modern humans, or rather apes and modern hominins, is something known as Ardipithecus. And back when I was in school, Ardipithecus had not been, or back when I was in elementary school, I should say, Ardipithecus had not been discovered yet. We learned about Lucy, who you've probably all heard about. But more recently, Ardipithecus ramidus has been discovered in a fossil form. This is a reconstruction of what Ardipithecus probably looked like. And it was very much a transitionary type of species that has certain characteristics shared with apes and certain characteristics shared with more hominin-like creatures or modern humans. And it does appear that Ardipithecus was bipedal and maybe showed signs of having a slightly increased cranium relative to its chimp ancestors, or the ancestor that it shares with chimps and bonobos. So that's kind of interesting. Ardipithecus shows up in the fossil record about 4.5 million years ago. So this is quite a long time ago that this organism existed somewhere in Africa. We don't really know what became of Ardipithecus because it doesn't show up in the fossil record again after the fact, but this does kind of lead us to kind of the most classic historical hominin fossil, Lucy, which belongs to the genus Australopithecus, specifically Australopithecus afarensis. And this has historically been kind of known as the best evidence of a fossil ancestor of modern humans, or formerly known as the oldest fossil evidence of modern humans. Of course, now we have Ardipithecus, but Australopithecus is dated at about 3 million years old. Again, this is an organism or a species that occurred in Africa quite a long time ago, and a partial reconstruction of the body of Lucy kind of points towards something that was very, very similar to a hominin or a modern human. And so this early on kind of provided some pretty interesting evidence to suggest that humans evolved from a more ape-like ancestor that existed quite a long time ago. And this, obviously was probably kind of controversial because this evidence suggests that humans are perhaps much older than suggested by religious texts, and that is, of course, hard for certain people to accept. But this is the evidence that we have on hand, suggesting that by about 3 million years ago, there was something quite similar to modern humans that already existed, but considered taxonomically different. And Lucy, by the way, was a pretty small individual, maybe something on the order of about 3 or 3.5 feet tall. So not nearly as tall as the average modern human. So then there's some other uncertainty going on around the time following Australopithecus. There's a second species of Australopithecus known as Australopithecus africanus, and this species appears to have maybe evolved further into another lineage or another species of Australopithecus that also disappears from the fossil record. So we don't know exactly what happened to Australopithecus, but we do know that closer to about 2.5 million years ago, the first genus of Homo appears on the scene, and that species is Homo habilis, which refers to hand. Habilis means hand. And so Homo habilis fossils are associated with significant tool use. And so that's why they're called, human hands. So this is really the first solid evidence we have of a society of species belonging to the same genus as us that was very significantly associated with the use of tools. And this is an interesting innovation in the lineage giving rise to our own species. And so Homo habilis is thought to have maybe occurred for something like maybe, I don't know, in the fossil record, maybe there's about 1 million years of evidence of this species existing until it kind of disappears from the fossil record. And there's other evidence that maybe it gave rise to another species of Homo known as Homo ergaster, which seems to have persisted longer than Homo habilis, in addition to some other hominin lineages like Homo erectus. Homo erectus refers to really upright walking. And so the fossil record from Homo erectus suggests that this was an organism that really, I mean, we know that these things were bipedal for a while, but these things were very succinctly or distinctly bipedal and perhaps a little bit taller than Lucy. And so anyway, Homo habilis and Homo ergaster and Homo erectus all seem to have existed at the same time, roughly between 1 and 2.5 million years ago, or Homo erectus maybe even more recently. And it's kind of interesting to think about a world where there were multiple species of Homo that potentially co-occurred with one another in Africa at one time. And if we think about how um, difficult it is for our own species to coexist with one another on our small planet, just as one species. Imagine if there were multiple species of Homo all trying to co-occur. It might have been kind of a violent scene. And we can start asking questions about why it is that not all of these species of Homo continue to persist today. Did they go extinct? Were they outcompeted? Or did they evolve into more advanced or more highly evolved lineages of Homo via anagenesis? Well, it turns out that there might be some evidence for the latter case. Whatever the case is, when we look a little bit more recently at the fossil record, say approximately about 1 million to 500,000 years ago, we see evidence of Homo heidelbergensis, yet another species of Homo arising in the fossil record, which seems to have existed around the same time as Homo erectus, and also this other species over here, Homo floresiensis, which is kind of scant in the fossil record. And then the most recent evidence from the fossil record suggests that there were two species of Homo that existed more recently, and those were Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And so Homo sapiens don't occur on the fossil record as a species until roughly about 200,000 years ago, along with Neanderthals too, which apparently have gone extinct. But we'll talk about them in a moment because apparently their DNA has not disappeared from the entire genome of modern Homo sapiens. And so the question again remains, did some of these lineages of Homo go extinct? Did some of these lineages evolve further via anagenesis? Kind of hard to say for sure, but we'll look at the patterns of that in a couple more slides. So what do we know about the radiation of humans? Because it's pretty, or I should say the radiation giving rise to Homo sapiens, it's pretty certain that all of these different lineages that we're looking at here all existed in Africa because that's where their fossils are recovered. But the question kind of remains, well, at what point in time did these particular lineages radiate out of Africa? And did they radiate out of Africa as a single species, or did they radiate out of Africa as multiple species that only were eventually dominated by the single species Homo sapiens? And so it's basically pretty well accepted that roughly just under 2 million years ago, Homo erectus did radiate out of Africa. And this is kind of a construction of what Homo erectus might have looked like. And that maybe the ancestors of Homo heidelbergensis radiated out of Africa something closer to about 600,000 years ago and gave rise ultimately to Neanderthals in Western Europe and Denisovans in Eastern Europe, Eurasia. And so it's pretty well understood that Homo erectus and Neanderthals and Denisovans had left Africa quite a long time ago. The question remains, did Homo sapiens evolve out of these lineages in Eurasia, or did Homo sapiens evolve in Africa only to later migrate out of Africa into Eurasia? And so this question has been debated at length by not just evolutionary biologists, but also by anthropologists. And it has led to the formation of two very major hypotheses that are have kind of been pretty hotly debated, although nowadays with genomic evidence, the answer is starting to kind of emerge which of these two hypotheses is probably more likely to be true. But without spoiling that answer for you, I will present the two hypotheses. The one hypothesis is known as the multi-regional hypothesis, and this is the hypothesis that, okay, well, all these different lineages of Homo share a common ancestor that existed something like 2 million years ago, that emerged in Africa as either Homo ergaster or Homo erectus, and then migrated out of Africa, then evolved into a new lineage via anagenesis that we would call Homo heidelbergensis, that once again, furthermore, went on to evolve into yet a new lineage, Homo sapiens, via anagenesis, something like 200,000 years ago. And this hypothesis suggests that kind of what we see here on the left, let's say, for example, that the lineage giving rise to modern Homo sapiens left Africa a long time ago, and that Homo sapiens evolved in Eurasia much later after this subsequent migration. So this puts Homo sapiens as not evolving in Africa. Their ancestors did evolve in Africa. Pretty much everybody agrees about that, but not everybody agrees about whether or not Homo sapiens evolved in Africa or if they evolved later in Eurasia. So that is kind of multi-regional hypothesis, that groups like Homo heidelbergensis could have colonized Western Eurasia, parts of the Middle East, and parts of Asia, only then to have later evolved into Homo sapiens. The contrasting hypothesis is famously known as the out of Africa hypothesis. And this hypothesis suggests that, well, okay, obviously we know that all the lineages of Homo share a common ancestor that existed something close to 2 million years ago. But this situation postulates that maybe Homo ergaster kind of differentiated from Homo erectus quite a long time ago, close to 1.5 million years ago, and that Homo ergaster went on its own trajectory, migrated out of Africa, and kind of did its own thing as its own species for quite a long time before ultimately going extinct relatively more recently. Whereas the lineage of Homo ergaster continued to live in Africa for a very long time, you know, a million years easily from the time of its common ancestor shared with Homo erectus, only to have evolved into Homo heidelbergensis via anagenesis, and then later, close to maybe about 500,000 years ago, Homo heidelbergensis underwent some diversification and gave rise to the lineage of Neanderthals and the lineage of Denisovans, which which did migrate out of Africa into Eurasia, but they also separately gave rise to the lineage of Homo sapiens, which only finally migrated out of Africa something close to 200,000 years ago. And this model also postulates some interesting things. One, that once Homo sapiens migrated out of Africa, they experienced significant amounts of gene flow with Neanderthals and Denisovans. And there's genomic evidence to suggest that, as I mentioned earlier. So there are certain human populations that appear to have certain segments of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA that appears to be an artifact of sort of ancient gene flow between these groups. Another interesting feature we see is that around the time that Homo sapiens migrate out of Africa and colonize Eurasia, we see Homo erectus extinct in the fossil record. And so we don't exactly know why Homo erectus suddenly went extinct. But it has been suggested that perhaps competition between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens led to the extinction of Homo erectus because Homo erectus was not as good as exploiting the sort of hominin niche as Homo sapiens were at the time. And so it has been suggested that Homo erectus simply went extinct because of competition with Homo sapiens. It's also possible that there are other explanations for their extinction, like maybe they were just dispersed in different environments that weren't as favorable to survival compared to environments where Homo sapiens occurred. But that idea has a little bit less support. But what we do know is Homo sapiens under this model probably did migrate out of Africa not long after they evolved 200,000 years ago and met up with their not too distant ancestors, or not too distant relatives, I should say, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, and did exchange genes. And eventually Neanderthals and Denisovans kind of disappear from the fossil record. And so we don't know if they did simply just go extinct, again, maybe because of competition with Homo sapiens, or maybe because of challenges in the environments where they occurred, or if via genetic introgression, the genomes of Neanderthals and Denisovans kind of just got absorbed into the gene pool of Homo sapiens, and they all sort of homogenized into a single species. So this is kind of like secondary contact via hybridization, where there is not reinforcement between these things being different species. So there are some different scenarios to kind of look at how this situation played out. What I can tell you is that the best evidence that we have at the present moment points toward the out of Africa hypothesis being the correct one, which would then suggest that humans evolved roughly not only did humans evolve roughly 200,000 years ago, but they migrated out of Africa only relatively more recently after that evolution. So once again, the out of Africa model is pretty widely supported in favor of Homo sapiens descending from an African ancestor that probably appeared something close to 200,000 years ago. And what's kind of interesting is we see that the human colonization of major continental landmasses happened really quickly, relatively speaking, pretty quickly, considering, we didn't have airplanes at this time, or these uh, populations, they had to travel by foot, and that was the only way they could get around. If we consider the fact that there was a major migration out of Africa something close to 60,000 years ago, which led to broad colonization of these continents, we see that human populations reached Europe by about 40,000 years ago and colonized Western Europe, then reached Southeast Asia by roughly 55,000 years ago, reached Australia by roughly 50,000 years ago, and then ultimately were able to cross the Bering Land Bridge during the Pleistocene roughly 20,000 years ago, when the Bering Land Bridge was covered with ice, facilitating the ability to go from Eastern Eurasia to Western North America. And that probably Homo sapiens reached Eastern North America by about 13,000 years ago, and finally reached South America via the Panama Land Bridge about 12,000 years ago. So North and South America were peopled in roughly only about 8,000 years. And so this is a pretty fast period of time that humans were able to colonize all of these areas. And we can start thinking about reasons why. Well, we can think about, first of all, these novel traits that make Homo sapiens kind of unique, or hominins kind of unique, but particularly Homo sapiens. Bipedality, enabling individuals to travel long distances more easily than their tetrapod ancestors. Oh, we're all tetrapod, but their quadruped ancestors, I guess is what I meant to say. So bipedality, enabling travel across this sort of large landscape to be facilitated. The increased cranium, maybe aiding with not just tool use, but being able to exploit a lot more niches across a very varied environment, where there are all kinds of different um, environmental resources that can be utilized, from Africa to Europe to Eurasia to Southeast Asia to Australia to North America to South America. This is a tremendous variety of different environments that earlier Homo sapiens were able to exploit in a whole bunch of different ways in order to survive. And so that could be correlated with this increased cranium and this ability to use tools and exploit all kinds of different resources. And so this is kind of an interesting thing. Not a lot of species have been able to do this. We can kind of look at a similar image here, showing again on the top here this sort of time frame over which humans have colonized the entire planet. And again, this shows that it happened fairly rapidly. And then we can look at a phylogenetic analysis kind of showing the relationship between various lineages of humans as this colonization progressed. And not surprisingly, we can see that there is a paraphyletic group of early Homo sapiens in Africa, a paraphyletic group of early Homo sapiens in the Middle East, more paraphyletic groups of early Homo sapiens in Europe, Central Asia, East Asia, and finally, the last radiation, or the most recent radiation of Homo sapiens, occurring in the Americas and Australia, particularly in the Americas. And this has some interesting consequences, because what we're seeing going on here from an evolutionary perspective is a whole series of founder events going on. We have a large population in Africa. A small subset of this population goes on to colonize parts of Western Europe. Small subset of this population goes on to colonize Eurasia. Yet smaller subsets of this population go on to colonize Eastern Eurasia and Australia. And yet even smaller and smaller subsets of this population go on to colonize North America, and an even smaller subset of this population goes on to colonize South America. How might this influence the evolution of genetic diversity within Homo sapiens via all of this colonization and all of these founder events? Well, we know that every time that there's a colonization event going on here, there's probably a little bit of a bottleneck event. And that bottleneck event is probably reshuffling around allele frequencies at random. And this is kind of causing a drift-like effect on gene diversity. And in fact, if we look at the progression of human populations from their origins in East Africa, this is Addis Ababa. It's the capital of Ethiopia. So this is measuring the distance from Addis Ababa. We can correlate the distance from Addis Ababa with mean heterozygosity of human populations. And what we see is that genetic drift has probably significantly reduced allelic diversity in humans as their populations have colonized more distant lands. Heterozygosity in the areas of Africa and the Middle East, where humans have their earliest origins and earliest migrations, heterozygosity is fairly high. But we can see as the human colonization progresses into Europe and Eurasia, and into Australia and into the Americas, that heterozygosity is significantly decreasing quite a bit. And so the indigenous or aboriginal or ancestral human populations, however you like to call them, of North America and South America have significantly lower genetic diversity compared to their ancestors in Africa. So that's kind of an interesting fact to think about. And this comes along with, of course, certain evolutionary implications in terms of how natural selection could be operating on human populations. We might postulate that the populations with highest heterozygosity are going to have the highest fitness in the face of environmental change, whereas the populations with the lowest heterozygosity are going to have a little bit lower fitness in the light of environmental change because they just don't have as many alleles, or their allele diversity is just not as high at any given locus. So this is an interesting situation that has played out in the history of our species. Now we can start talking about really interesting situation where all kinds of different novel adaptations have evolved in Homo sapiens in response to a whole broad range of global conditions. And this is sort of an artifact of Homo sapiens having colonized practically every single continent on the planet, which is really an amazing feat. And by virtue of having migrated into all kinds of different, very contrasting environments, all kinds of different, interesting kinds of adaptations have been selected for in humans. And so our species is by no means free of the forces of natural selection. And so we can look at some of these interesting traits like the marine diet, or lactose tolerance, or malaria resistance, or cholera resistance, or resistance to an arsenic-rich environment, or ability to withstand living in extremely cold climates, or ability to withstand living in extremely high elevations where there's not a lot of oxygen, or the ability to develop light skin pigmentation in parts of the planet that don't have as much sunlight as the part of the planet where Homo sapiens first evolved, or even the evolution of short stature. And so we can see different parts of the planet where these different traits have been favored by selection. For example, lactose tolerance in the pastoralist societies of Europe, which we'll look at in just a second in a little bit more detail. But lactose tolerance is an interesting trait that has arisen in areas where people have developed really intimate relationships with raising livestock. And that trait also tends to be correlated with light skin pigmentation at a higher latitude environment. We also see that in sort of more southern Africa. Things like malaria resistance in these sort of tropical environments in South America and Africa and Indonesia. Things like resistance to an extremely cold climate, like in Greenland or northern Russia, or things like adaptation to a almost purely marine diet, again, in places like Greenland. So these are just a few examples. I guess we could also look at adaptation to high elevation. We have the Andes Mountains in South America, which reach to, I'm going to use feet here because I can't do the calculation off the top of my head, but the Andes reach to about 23,000 feet in height, and human societies have been distributed close to the peak of these mountains for quite a long time. Likewise, in the mountains of East Africa, they're pretty high. Think about places like Kilimanjaro and things like that. And the Himalayas, of course, the highest mountain range in the world, where people have lived for a very long time at elevations, 15, 20,000 feet, which is pretty challenging. If you were to go to 15 or 20,000 feet right now, get off the airplane, you'd be having a very hard time breathing. So anyway, these are just examples of a bunch of interesting adaptations that we see have evolved in different human populations in response to a whole bunch of varied environments across the Earth's landscape. Now, more recently, and probably one of the most important features of human society that have evolved, we see the advent of agriculture. And agriculture evolved independently on multiple occasions in multiple parts of the planet in multiple different human populations about 11,000 years ago. So this is, if you don't know, kind of at the end of the Pleistocene or at the end of the last major ice age. We see a situation where multiple human societies are starting to take up a way of life where they've learned how to domesticate plant crops. And there is a whole diversity of different plant crops that human populations have learned to exploit across the globe. The three most principal crops you've probably heard of, and we've almost all probably certainly consumed, are rice, wheat, and maize. And we can think of rice as being one of the principal original agricultural crops in Southeast Asia, wheat being kind of one of the principal agricultural crops to originally arise in the Middle East and spread throughout Europe, and maize being a principal agricultural crop in Central America that people are still dependent upon today for survival. And we can also talk about things like potatoes being really, really important crops in South America. There's a huge diversity of different potato strains that people have raised in South America and still do today. And also things like quinoa, which is a grain in the family Amarantaceae, or amaranth. It's an amaranth. Things like millet also in West Africa, and many other different types of crops that have been raised across the globe. But the point is that the advent of agricultural domestication kind of really allowed human civilization. We use the word civilization. This really allowed civilization to flourish because this really changed the way of life of people who were able to transition from a nomadic hunter-gatherer way of life to a more sedentary way of life where folks kind of didn't move around as much anymore and they kind of stayed close to where they were raising their crops. And this afforded folks a lot of spare time because, yeah, they'd have to put energy into, finding a suitable place to raise these crops and taking care of them and ultimately harvesting them. But there was a lot of downtime on the side that formerly would have been spent migrating, hunting, doing things like that, gathering food. Now they're just waiting for the food to grow. And this, we think, at least if you talk to an anthropologist, is something that allowed human society to start developing other forms of technology, other forms of cultural traditions, other forms of language, communication. Ultimately, maybe this leads to the advent of written history. But this is really something that takes humans to the next level once they have agriculture. And we start to see the significant development of human culture following the advent of agriculture. Another major innovation is this lactose persistence gene that I had mentioned a moment ago. Now, not everybody has this, but basically this is a gene that arises via a mutation in the second chromosome, and maybe it's related to some mutations in these other chromosomes as well. But the lactase persistence gene, LCT, does occur in the second human chromosome. And this mutation has allowed humans to continue to digest lactose, which is a sugar found in milk. It allows adult humans to consume lactose throughout their lives. Now, the ancestral state in our species is for us to be able to consume lactose when we are very young, during the earliest stages of development, and then the gene for digesting lactose goes away, or it's no longer expressed, I should say more specifically. But the lactase persistence gene is a mutant version that allows lactose to be digested throughout your entire life. And this gene is thought to have been a very important adaptation in early pastoralist societies who had a very tight link with raising domestic livestock. And they made a living off of digesting products of these animals that contain the sugar lactose, things like milk, for example. And we can see this image here on the right showing a map of Europe, and we can see that the frequency of the gene LCT, the lactase persistence gene, increases in certain areas with the dark green, by the way. So the darker shades of green have higher frequencies of the lactase persistence gene. This gene is increasing in frequency in parts of Northern Europe where pastoralist society was really a big thing during the earliest stages of human colonization of this area. And so natural selection had acted on favoring this mutation because individuals who carried it had a higher chance of survival because they were able to live off this available food source in lactose that was being produced by their livestock. And many of the common ancestors, or many, I should say, many of the descendants of Europeans carry the lactase persistence gene. But many people who don't have very close ancestry to Europe don't carry the lactase persistence gene, and they are what we call lactose intolerant. And I mean, I think it's kind of funny to think about this. When I was a child, lactose intolerance was kind of thought of as some bad thing. But in fact, it's the ancestral condition of our species to be lactose intolerant, and lactase persistence only evolved more recently in pastoralist society, and then that gene was passed on to certain descendants of those ancestors. Anyway, this has been yet another really interesting innovation that has been favored by natural selection in our species. This data here in this table, by the way, was taken by comparing ancient DNA from ancient human fossils taken from all across Western Europe and comparing that DNA to that of modern humans who live in the same location. So that's just what this map is trying to show you here, how old the DNA was that was recovered and used in this analysis to figure out which genes are possibly related to lactose tolerance or lactase persistence. And so again, LCT is the main gene, but there's these other genes over here on these other chromosomes that are also correlated with lactase persistence as well. Now, the agricultural way of life and the pastoralist way of life were, of course, common in many parts of the globe, as we know. But here in the American Southwest, where we currently live, that was not really the case. As it turns out, indigenous groups in the American Southwest were mostly still hunter-gatherer societies right up until the time that they first made contact with European colonists, with a few exceptions. But the hunter-gatherer way of life was very much the key to success for majority of indigenous groups in the American Southwest. This map here on the left shows something kind of interesting. It's what's known as a Chemehuevi Salt Song, and it's indicating the route of the Salt Song Trail. And you might be wondering, what does a song have to do with the trail? Well, the way that the Chemehuevi knew how to embark on a hunting circuit was to learn the route of that hunting circuit in a song, which was taught to them by their elders or their immediate family. And the song included all of the directions in order to complete the hunting circuit. And so this is very much a product of oral history. And this is how the knowledge of where the viable hunting grounds for this particular group existed. And this has been passed down for many generations, and the Chemehuevi salt songs are still preserved today, thankfully. Although Chemehuevis, I don't think, are really undergoing this practice anymore. But this is very much what their way of life was to travel around this desert environment or this arid environment, going to various areas where they knew that they could successfully hunt and also gather various foods. But this was mainly for hunting. And so this strategy kind of necessitated the formation of nomadic societies. And so a lot of Southwestern indigenous groups moved around a lot. and they would move around with the seasons, and they would move from place to place depending on where resources were most plentiful. And of course, we know that the seasons are quite varied here in the American Southwest from summer to winter. And so there were various reasons to spend the summer in certain locations and various reasons to spend the winter in other locations, and various reasons why to collect various food sources at certain times of year, and of course, sort of store those food resources for times of the year when food was not going to be very plentiful. And part of an artifact of this strategy in Southwestern indigenous culture was that population sizes from one group to the next were not very large. For example, the Tongva here in Southern California, that's the indigenous group that would have occurred in the San Fernando Valley. Their population size, last I read about this, was estimated at being something like 30,000 individuals. So that's not a very large population compared to the population size that occurs in the San Fernando Valley today, obviously. But even though these populations weren't particularly big, they were completely sustainable. There, there was, as far as we know from historical records, never any evidence of food shortage or famine, or even really a whole lot of war between these various groups. They tended to exist in a fairly harmonious society or set of societies, and they were able to persist for quite a long time until the original European contact arose. One exception to this story, though, however, comes with the Puebloan cultures of the so-called Four Corners region, which is, if you don't know, right here where Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. This is the Four Corners region. Puebloan culture existed in this area about 1,000 years ago. It was predated by something called the basket maker culture. But basically, the Puebloan culture is one exception to this rule of sort of nomadic indigenous society. Well, there are a couple others, but for example, some of the groups that lived along the Colorado River did practice agriculture as well because they had access to year-round water. But the Puebloan culture was very, very successful at one time at living off of an agricultural system based on the production of maize. And it's kind of interesting to think about how maize culture existed in the Colorado Plateau, or the so-called Four Corners area. Well, 1,000 years ago or more, maize culture diffused out of Central America into the present day American Southwest. And so maize culture existed in the American Southwest by connection to Central America. And as it turns out, between 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 years ago, whatever the case may be, the climate of this area was much different. And the climate of this area was conducive to raising maize. Um, Probably this indicates that the climate was a little bit more subtropical, a little bit warmer, perhaps a little bit wetter, and somewhat more similar to the climate of Central America, such that societies were able to make a living off of raising corn or maize. And this was extremely successful for a really long time. As a matter of fact, as far as we know, this led to some of the most successful and largest forms of civilization in Southwestern indigenous culture that we have any evidence of. And the best evidence of this comes from a place called Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, where there uh, are the remains of enormously large sets of dwellings that are very extensive, that had to have housed thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And there's strong evidence to show that this particular civilization subsisted on maize culture. When the first European colonists arrived at Chaco Canyon, they found this place abandoned. And archaeologists have been sort of perturbed by this for a really long time. How is it that this society apparently flourished uh, based on maize culture in the Four Corners region and appeared to have just up and vanished with no explanation whatsoever? And this society had, all kinds of additional technology as well, by virtue of being an agricultural society. And so they seem to have been doing really well. Why all of a sudden do they just disappear out of nowhere? Well, the hypothesis or best explanation that has been presented for this situation is not surprising. That the advent of maize culture in the Four Corners region ceased because of climate change. And the ability to successfully raise maize failed roughly about 900 years ago because the climate started to become too cold to raise maize. And so these crops were not able to survive in a kind of cold climate, relatively speaking. And so this forced the Puebloan people to abandon this area. And it's been suggested that Puebloan culture has sort of diffused into many of the other surrounding cultures, other indigenous groups in this area, such as the Anasazi, for example, the Navajo, perhaps more modern groups. But anyway, this is an interesting sign of warning that agricultural society is deceptive in its reliability. That crops can indeed fail, and entire civilizations dependent upon a single crop species could really be in the face of turmoil if climate changes and makes raising those crops unsuccessful. And so this should be a warning to our society at the present moment that, hey, we are dependent upon agriculture largely for our survival, and we are certainly facing a climate change crisis. And who's to say that something like this couldn't happen to our population? One moment, I'm going to close the window. So anyway, this is an interesting story that we should heed warning from in our reliance upon agriculture, because agriculture allows population sizes to grow so extensively. But then if that agricultural crop fails, what is this huge population going to do for sustenance? And that leads us to a very realistic problem, which is human population growth. And we can look at real data that takes a look at censuses of human population size going back to the middle 19th century to the sort of present time. And we can see that human population size has increased more than 500% in the last 200 years. We've gone from having 1.2 billion people in the world during the middle 19th century to closer to 8 billion people living on the planet today. And we might start asking questions about, well, what are some major implications of this trend? Well, the situation isn't the prettiest always. If we look at some of these examples of really, really crowded urban environments, really, really polluted urban environments, we could start talking about, well, ecologically, humans are a species, and humans are not really any different in terms of how natural selection can operate on us compared to other species, as we've already seen some examples of. And so this means that Homo sapiens have to deal with things like a carrying capacity. Homo sapiens have to deal with things like competition. Homo sapiens have to deal with things like the struggle for existence, as was proposed by Thomas Malthus and discussed by Charles Darwin. And so as our population sizes continue to really skyrocket, we're going to see a situation where maybe there really will be a struggle for existence that's more evident than it is at the present moment. And if things like agricultural systems fail because of climate change, we could see widespread population crash. We could see famine. We could see war. We could see a lot of really negative outcomes as a virtue of this really intense struggle for existence occurring within our own species if we don't come up with some type of a solution to the problem, and if we don't do that relatively soon. Unfortunately, as most of you all know, there is not a whole lot of cohesion amongst various societies on our planet. And that lack of cohesion is something that can definitely lead to the demise of our species. We can talk about how human population growth is projected to change in maybe three different contrasting scenarios. And so this is obviously population size here on the y-axis and the numbers of billions, and time on the x-axis going from a long time ago, before we were all born, to a long time from now when we'll probably all be dead. And this is kind of close to the present moment here. We're not quite there yet, but this is close to the present moment. And our population size is indeed pretty close to 8 billion at the moment. And we can kind of look at these three scenarios where we see human population continuing to grow almost exponentially to the point that our population is something close to 36 billion individuals by the year 2300, which seems unlikely. We can talk about our population size kind of leveling off at its present amount, maybe increasing a little bit more, but not really ever growing past that point, which is kind of hard for us to imagine it increasing past this point. Or we could talk about our population size actually having peaked at the present moment and being projected to decline somewhat in the future down into the lower billions, kind of closer to what the population of size of humans was in the 19th century. Now, these scenarios kind of necessitate some possible things. For example, if human population size is projected to increase to something like 36 billion by the year 2300, we would have to postulate that there are simply just unlimited resources, which is almost impossible because we know from the laws of thermodynamics that energy is unlimited, thus resources also have to be unlimited. So how is it possible that human population size could grow to this amount over this period of time, considering the fact that there are already a lot of constraints on population size at present at the size of 8 billion. We can ask questions about, in these other two scenarios, whether or not humans have actually finally reached their carrying capacity and whether or not we've slightly overshot it. And then our population size is going to kind of go down and kind of stay around our carrying capacity for the foreseeable future. That seems to be a fairly plausible scenario. The third scenario, where human population size declines, indicates something else. Perhaps the situation will become a little bit more dire in the future. There might be, again, famine, agricultural crops failing, um, diseases wiping out large amounts of our population, things like war, causing large amounts of individuals to perish because of, bloodshed. And a situation like that kind of forcing our population size to go back down to what it was. So anyway, these are all possible scenarios. Does anybody know what's going to happen? No. Can we be forward thinking about this and apply our knowledge of science and apply our knowledge of evolutionary principles to understanding what we might expect to happen to our population? Yes. Do I think that's what we should do? Yes, we have a tremendous amount of knowledge and a lot of really great technology, and we can use this knowledge in some productive ways to come up with an educated understanding of what we could expect to happen to our species in the future. I talked for a moment there about disease, and disease is something that is really kind of beyond our control. Now we've developed a lot of technology to manage disease. As we know, we have all kinds of different drugs that can treat bacterial infections, for example, which are shown here on this graph. And what we see on this graph on the bottom, that is, are all of these different drugs that have been developed going back to the 1930s. And this graph is basically showing two color bars, blue and red. The blue bars are showing when the antibiotics were first deployed, and the red bars are showing when the bacteria that were being, the bacterial infections that were being treated with these drugs, these bacteria started to become resistant to these drugs. And so what we can see is that from 1930 to 1950, this particular drug was pretty successful at preventing antibacterial infections, but then by 1950, the bacteria had developed resistance to the drug because of natural selection. And in some ways, we could also almost call this artificial selection, but maybe it's more accurate to call this a version of inadvertent artificial selection or inadvertent natural selection, where we were inadvertently selecting for the most resistant bacterial strains by giving people all of these drugs. Every so often, there were probably mutations that arose in these bacterial populations that were resistant to these drugs, and those populations of bacteria continued to persist. And we see this with not just this one drug, but with all of these drugs shown on this plot. And this is a whole lot of different drugs. Uh, Penicillin came on the scene in the 40s, and it was effective only for maybe about 10 years, maybe not even 10 years. Streptomycin, likewise, came on the scene in the 1940s and maybe was really only effective up until 1960. Likewise, for each of these other drugs, they were really only effective for so long until the bacteria evolved to be able to resist them. And even right up until modern times, we're dealing with a situation where the bacteria populations that are infecting us continue to develop resistance to the drugs we use to try to kill them. Um, we might start asking questions about how this could play out in the future of human host populations. Will we ultimately ever be able to overcome bacterial infections, or are they ultimately going to be the demise of many human populations because we just simply don't have any drugs that can treat bacterial infections into the future. So this leads to sort of broader question. We know the advent of agriculture really greatly facilitated the development of culture and human technological innovation, but we might want to ask the question whether or not this was really for better or for worse. From the earliest technology of various tools that we've been able to develop out of stone, or things like being able to make cordage for baskets, rope, weaving things, which allows us to build more complicated things, to metallurgy, which allows us to implement some of our stone tools with metal tools, to the development of things like gunpowder, which is maybe a more nefarious invention, which allows individual populations to compete with one another via conflict, to the development of nuclear energy, which has a lot of plus sides to it, but it's also been used for some very terrible things, like the development of the first atomic bomb, which sadly our country is the only country to have ever used in a war setting to really ruthlessly kill people, to us developing technology that has allowed us to land a rover on another planet, the planet of Mars. That's the Mars rover here. So, what is the ultimate fate of all of this technology? Is it really something that has driven our species in a beneficial direction, or is it really more something that has driven our species in a detrimental direction without us really realizing it? Well, I think the answer is it depends upon whose hands the technology falls into, right? And if we are to successfully colonize another planet like Mars, are we going to go out there and simply make a mess of it, kind of like we've been doing to our own planet? Well, humans successfully colonizing Mars is, of course, an extremely debatable possibility. But it's certainly one possibility that people have discussed as an alternative to us dealing with the overpopulation problem on our planet. But there's a lot of caveats that come along with being able to successfully colonize another planet that has almost no oxygen on it at all. And maybe we might just end up killing each other with nuclear weapons before that ever even happens, which would be a sad outcome, but unfortunately, it's an outcome that is not entirely out of the realm of possibilities. So this leads to something that I had mentioned very briefly in class, and I was hoping to expose everyone to, and that is the fact that the magnitude of human influence that our planet, that humans have had on our planet, has prompted geologists and other scientists to propose something known as the Anthropocene concept. And so we talked about geologic time periods in class. We looked at a geologic time scale going back from the origins of the origins of life, the origins of Earth to modern time. And at present, the modern geological period we live in is known as the Holocene, but scientists are now saying, well, we actually should call this the Anthropocene now. So the breaks between all these different geologic time periods are associated with significant events in the Earth's history. And so scientists are saying the influence of humans on the planet has become so significant that it prompts a new geological time period that we should call the Anthropocene. And we can talk about some of these features of human society that have really changed the planet, like widespread industrial pollution. This is an image from China. And if you don't know, China is pretty notorious for enormous amounts of industrial pollution that they don't really seem to want to do anything about. We can talk about things like widespread water pollution. This is a picture of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. If you haven't heard of this, there is a sea of plastic floating around out in the Pacific Ocean, or I should say, an island of plastic floating around out in the Pacific Ocean that nobody really knows what to do about. And it's just simply out there. It's harming marine life. It's um, driving down the quality of the water. And as these plastics break down in the Pacific Ocean, they start to turn into microplastics that are really, really tiny that sort of distribute within the water column. And as they break down, they become nearly impossible to get rid of. We could talk about things like deforestation, which is pretty widespread across the globe, particularly in the Amazon tropical region, where large amounts of forests are being cut down in order to develop agriculture. And so this is an interesting thing. This is thought to very significantly be contributing to climate change because forests are carbon sinks and they are taking a lot of carbon and sequestering it into wood and into trunks and root systems of of plants. And of course, plants do photosynthesis, so they're taking carbon dioxide out of the environment and putting more oxygen into it. So as we see more and more deforestation, we're seeing more and more carbon accumulate in the atmosphere. And this kind of goes hand in hand with things like wildfires, um, both natural and unnatural wildfires. One of the byproducts of deforestation is wildfire, where a lot of people will burn entire swaths of forest in order to use it to develop agriculture. And then we could talk about the fact that there is climate change exacerbating wildfires that are happening maybe naturally, but they're happening more rapidly than they might have without the influence of human-induced climate change. And that is drought stress in forest environments, causing larger wildfires to occur than have historically. And if you live in, we all live in California, so you're probably aware that we've been having significant problems with wildfires for quite a while now, especially in the last few years. Wildfires used to be historically about 10,000 acres on average in California. We have different lines of evidence to suggest this. But now we're seeing wildfires in excess of 200 acres. I mean, these are massive fires. This is like fires large enough to wipe out an entire national forest. And so this, like deforestation, is releasing tremendous amounts of carbon dioxide that's been sequestered in these forests into the atmosphere, thus increasing the effects of climate change, and thus increasing the greenhouse effect in the atmosphere. Things like strip mining, and so huge amounts of earth being dug out and mined for various minerals that might be useful for us, but strip mining has a lot of downstream ecological effects on all the different organisms that occur in and around the areas that have been mined. Things like renewable energy development, well, sounds really, really good on paper, but this particular example here is the Ivanpah solar facility in the Mojave Desert, which has taken up a huge amount of natural land and destroyed tremendous amounts of habitat for natural species in this environment. It's also an eyesore, but it's also something that generates a lot of money for the people who own it. And it's being advertised as a clean alternative to fossil fuel. Well, it might be a clean alternative to fossil fuel, but it also comes along with a tremendous amount of ecological degradation. Things like planetary protection, which you may or may not ever have heard of, but we are trying to go to space. We've already sent a rover to Mars. And if you didn't know why the Mars rover went to Mars, the actual impetus of the mission was to find any signs of life that might have existed on Mars. And so an artifact, an inherent problem of doing this is that if we find life on Mars, how do we know that we didn't bring it there accidentally? So when they are sending spacecrafts out to Mars to look for life, the engineers building these spacecrafts have to be extremely careful to maintain a very, very sterile environment. I mean, this is kind of a crazy thing to think about, but this is in fact what our species is doing. And then of course, things like global warming, which kind of goes hand in hand with some of these other problems, particularly deforestation and increased carbon emissions into the atmosphere. But, you know, global ice glaciers are melting and they're kind of melting at an alarming rate. And this is causing sea level to rise. And this has all kinds of implications. Biologically or ecologically, this has implications for organisms that depend upon these types of environments for survival. But not only that, as sea level rises, we might think about, well, where are the majority of human populations settled at the present moment? Oh, the majority of them are settled next to the ocean. So as sea level rises, if it rises significantly enough, it could start to impede upon areas where humans have settled in very, very large numbers. And so that's just a couple implications of what global warming can do. It also might lead to really drastic and unexpected, unpredictable changes in climate, not just heating, but maybe unexpected periods of cooling as well in certain parts of the planet. So anyway, these are all factors that contribute to why we are calling this the Anthropocene now, or at least why some people are calling this the Anthropocene now. Not everyone agrees with applying this concept, but a lot of people do. And then lastly, we can talk about how a human population expansion inherently involves a lot of biological conservation issues. And so if we start at the sort of baseline of what human population expansion requires, it requires increasing human population and consumption of things, and mainly food. So this is agriculture, logging, which equals deforestation, fisheries, things like industry and increased fossil fuel use, We already saw some examples of this in the previous slide. Increasing urbanization, expanding cities, increasing road construction, railway construction. As human populations grow, people are going to need to live places, and this is going to require building more infrastructure. And things like international trade across the globe. All of these demands that go hand in hand with increasing human population and consumption have a entire array of downstream effects that have all kinds of interesting interacting feedback loops, or interacting feedback networks, I should say. And so, for example, as there's more agriculture and logging and fishing, there's going to be increased habitat loss for natural species, increased habitat fragmentation for natural species. And we know that habitat fragmentation tends to impede gene flow. And when gene flow goes down, this tends to increase genetic drift. This kind of tends to lead to overall loss of genetic diversity in species. And this whole situation also can kind of lead to habitat degradation, including the results of pollution. And this can go hand in hand with things like overexploitation, developing too much agriculture, logging too much, fishing too much, exhausting our resources in order to meet the demands of an increasingly growing population. Kind of inevitably leads to overexploitation of resources. And this kind of all goes hand in hand with climate change, because as we are engaging more in activities like logging, which are sort of destroying our carbon sinks, and we are developing more industry, we are contributing more to climate change. And climate change, as it increases, is in turn going back and increasing more habitat degradation, and maybe leading to the expansion of more invasive species and the expansion of more diseases. Also, likewise, as we're undergoing international trade, invasive species are being inadvertently introduced, diseases are being inadvertently introduced, whether these are human diseases or diseases that are affecting other organisms, particularly agricultural organisms. There's this interesting feedback going back and forth here. And this all ultimately kind of leads to a loss of sustainability. As human population expands so much and the demand for resources becomes so high, the sustainability of that situation starts to deteriorate. And that is a very, very dangerous situation. The ultimate end to all this is ecosystem collapse, which basically prevents the persistence of natural resources. And that is directly tied to loss of biodiversity. We're already seeing this loss of biodiversity happening in certain parts of the globe where we have extensive amounts of agriculture, extensive amounts of logging. For example, areas that are being deforested in the tropics. There are probably all kinds of different species that occur in those areas that are yet to be described, that are going extinct rapidly, that we'll never even know existed. And so that's one problem. Again, the degradation of ecosystems by virtue of us over-exploiting them for resources. Ecosystems will still persist, but they probably won't exist at such a high quality as they have historically. And again, the erosion of genetic diversity and evolutionary potential. So as there is habitat loss, habitat fragmentation and degradation, and population sizes are maybe forced to either become smaller or not exchange genes as much, and things like genetic drift increase, genetic diversity will go away. And genetic diversity is an inherent part of biodiversity. When we talk about biodiversity, we're not just talking about species richness, but we're talking about the richness of the set of genes that exist within a given species. That is also part of biodiversity. And it's the richness of the sets of genes that exist within species that give them evolutionary potential. The more different polymorphic alleles that exist within populations, the higher their ability to deal with evolutionary change. And so as biodiversity is degraded, so is evolutionary potential. And all of this points toward erosion of actual support systems for human society. We go all the way back to the beginning of this talk to the sort of origins of the hominin lineage and the origins of Homo sapiens. We have depended upon all kinds of various resources for survival for a long time, starting with our earliest origins as scavengers, living off of bone marrow, to have reached a point now where we have advanced agricultural systems that we highly depend upon. And a lot of these different support systems actually have ecological dependency that is probably not obvious to a lot of people. But this all points toward the fact that there is a human ecology. And we are very much part of the ecology of the planet. And it's virtually impossible for us to separate ourselves from that. And it's evident by looking at this framework here shown in this sort of um, feedback network of various factors dictating how demands for resources in our population can sort of indirectly ultimately lead to entire ecosystem collapse. So this is stuff people need to be thinking about. You are in this class because you want an education, and so you are learning about this, but the average person on the street might not have any idea the implications that all of this has for the ultimate survival of our species, and they might not really even have any idea how it is that we went from a common ancestor that was an ape, that's a common ancestor shared with chimps and bonobos, to our present contemporary form, facing a very, very dire situation in the future. Maybe not in our immediate lifetimes, but within the next several generations, all these factors are certainly going to be very, very important for the persistence of Homo sapiens. All right, that's my speech and the final thought of this class. So I hope you enjoyed all this. I hope you learned something and take this information forward with you as a citizen, as a scientist, as a student, and as a human being. All right. Cheers, folks.